Today is about Levan Saginishvili. Levan is the strongest arm wrestler we've ever seen, and it's not even close. He's so strong that he hasn't lost a single match in almost 7 years. He's so strong that everyone loses their mind if he even gets slowed down for a couple seconds. He lifts weights that other arm wrestlers only dream of lifting. Levan is truly the final boss of arm wrestling. But why is Levan so good? How is he so much stronger than everyone else? In this video, we're going to take a look at the exact areas of strength Levan has that make him so impossible to defeat, starting with elbow flexion. Your elbow flexors consist of 3 primary muscles: your bicep, which is the one people care about, and then your brachioradialis and your brachialis. For a long time throughout Levan's progression, although very impressive, his elbow flexor was not the best in the world. The world record elbow flexor belonged to Denis Saplinkov. Denis had done some lifts that were absolutely insane. He was curling 140 kilograms for reps and making it look easy. He was curling barbells with one arm, and he had the notorious 87 kilogram back pressure lift, and he did it for multiple reps. It was looking like no one was ever going to be close to Denis in elbow flexor driven lifts. But over the last couple years, Levan's elbow flexor has become way stronger. Initially, we saw Levan curl 130 kilograms, which is super impressive, but not in the world record territory. Later on, we saw him hit a 142 kilogram bicep curl, and it looked even easier than the 130 kilogram lift. And then, partway through 2023, Levan managed to curl 165 kilograms for 3 repetitions. 165 kilos. That's 363 pounds. According to strengthlevel.com, the average male deadlift is 336 pounds. So Levan is taking the average dude's max deadlift, throwing more weight on it, and then curling it for reps. This lift from Levan is easily the most impressive curl I've ever seen, all things considered. Now, Hermes Gasparini has also managed to lift a ton of weight on an elbow flexor lift. Hermes lifted 92 kilograms on a rocking back pressure lift. That's over 200 pounds with a single arm, which is definitely amazing, but it's difficult to know exactly how Hermes' lift compares to Levan's lift. I don't think that Hermes can curl 165 kilos, but I'm not totally sure that Levan could match Hermes' lift either. So does Levan have the strongest elbow flexor in the world? In the end, I think he probably does. One thing that is important to consider is the fact that Levan's forearm is longer than either Denis or Hermes' forearm. This means that his elbow flexor has to work harder to lift the same amount of weight, and I think this is the determining factor that allows me to say that Levan Saginishvili has the strongest elbow flexor in history. Next, we will talk about wrist flexion. In arm wrestling, wrist flexion plus finger flexion equals cupping, but wrist flexion is more important these days as nearly all high-level arm wrestling matches take place in the straps. And in the case of wrist flexion, this is where Levan really shines. With elbow flexion, there was a bit of a debate as to whether or not Levan was the strongest. But with wrist flexion, it's not even close. Levan is the strongest, and he has 0 competition. The most notable lifts that come to mind are Levan's 90 kilogram wrist curl for 5 reps and the legendary 100 kilogram wrist curl. No one has ever been able to even get close to these lifts using the exact same form we see here. And on top of this, Levan has a very long hand. The length of Levan's hand means that the dumbbell is very far away from his wrist. And this means that once again, Levan has to work harder to lift the same amount of weight. Despite Levan having a leverage disadvantage in this lift, he still has the world record in the wrist curl by a mile. This is how insanely strong Levan's wrist flexor is. And from a more practical perspective, it's clear to see how this is reflected on the table. Levan managed to contain Vitaly Laletin's low hand top roll that destroys the wrist of nearly everyone he goes up against. Levan is the only arm wrestler in years who didn't lose his wrist while arm wrestling versus Devin Larratt. Devin went into a full-blown King's move and Levan still contained it. I don't think it's even disputed that Levan has the strongest wrist flexion and the strongest cupping in the history of arm wrestling. He's just that strong in this lane. So, thus far, we've established that Levan has the strongest wrist flexion in history and probably the strongest elbow flexion in history. But what about side pressure? Unfortunately, there isn't a ton of footage of Levan working direct side pressure, but that's fine, we don't need that. We have something even better to measure Levan's side pressure. We have legendary arm wrestler and mad scientist Uncle Todd. Uncle Todd is known as the side pressure king, so if anyone would know how good Levan's side pressure is, it would be Uncle Todd. Everyone's seen the video of Levan arm wrestling Larry Wheels and 47 rubber bands. What Todd did is he tried to recreate the setup and measure the resistance from the rubber bands. He then added the resistance of Larry Wheels on top of this and concluded that Levan has 240 pounds of side pressure, which is a world record by a mile. What's that? You're questioning Uncle Todd's side pressure calculation methods? Stop that, you troublemaker. As far as a more sport-specific measurement goes, we can look at Levan's recent results while arm wrestling in a hook. Although a hook is certainly not only about side pressure is a major component. If you're beating everyone in a hook, you probably have a lot of side pressure. And since Levan has not lost at all in the last several years, he obviously hasn't lost to anyone in a hook either. So overall, Levan's side pressure, while difficult to measure precisely, is clearly very strong. But is it the best side pressure in history? We have seen Levan struggle to finish matches with side pressure in the past, even when he's had full hand control. Against Hermes Gasparini, for example, he destroyed Hermes in terms of the hand and wrist battle, but Levan was struggling to finish the match with his side pressure. So while Levan's side pressure is of course at the elite level, I don't know that it's the best in the history of the sport. Now what about pronation? One of the most famous lifts we've ever seen Levan do is the 100 kg static pronation lift. But again, this lift is pretty difficult to measure because of the vector it takes place in. If Levan lifted this weight while his forearm was parallel to the ground, this would have been the most impressive pronation lift I've ever seen. But the steeper forearm angle makes it a lot easier and more difficult to judge. Luckily, Levan has recently tried the legendary Devin Larratt pronation lift. And just like everyone else, he totally botched the technique. But if anything, he may have actually made it a little harder on himself. Now, Levan didn't go for any huge PRs in this video, but after trying the lift, he said that he is going to break Devin's record in the next few months. Devin Larratt is widely considered to have the best pronation in the world, and Devin has managed right around 155 pounds on this lift. But after trying a similar lift, Levan said he is confident that he can break it in a couple months. So based off of Levan's estimate of his own 1 rep max, it sounds like he might just have the best pronation in the world as well. However, I do want to see him actually break the record before declaring Levan the official pronation king. So what about more traditional stuff like bench squat deadlift? The bench press is an area where Levan is very impressive in. Levan has benched 260 kilograms. While this isn't all that close to a powerlifting world record, it is very impressive for an arm wrestler. The bench press is not a lift that has a great carryover to arm wrestling, so Levan is kinda just bench pressing for fun, and he still is lifting nearly 600 pounds raw. Amongst other arm wrestlers, this is a very good result. As for the deadlift, we've seen Levan manage a 220 kilogram axle block pull with straps. And on top of this, Levan can nearly half squat his body weight, which puts him in the 99th percentile when compared to other arm wrestlers' leg strength. We also know that he's done at least 1 leg day in the past 6 months, which is also very impressive. Okay, so Levan definitely has the strongest wrist flexion, he probably has the strongest elbow flexion, and he might have the strongest side pressure and pronation. But if he doesn't, he's probably at least top 5. And this is why Levan is so strong on the table. It's incredibly rare to be the strongest in even one of these areas, but Levan is the strongest in 2 of them and maybe even more than 2 of them. Levan isn't just beating you in one area of strength, he's beating you in multiple lanes at the same time. This is what leaves people with such a hopeless feeling when they go up against him. No matter which direction they try to pull in, Levan is still gonna crush them. And this is why Levan Saginashvili is the strongest arm wrestler in history.